Yeah, I'm in your hands. And
Great.
you're used to doing these virtual by now as much as I am, I'm sure.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with the Honorable Erin O'Toole. I'm Nicole Shepard, Manager of Policy and Partnerships with the Regina District Chamber of Commerce. I would like to start off by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we're gathered on virtually today. We have come together on Treaty 4 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. We also acknowledge the traditional homeland of the Métis and honor their contributions. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories and are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I would like to take a quick moment to thank TD Bank, our sponsor for today's event. Thank you very much for your continued support. Because of you, we're able to continue to hold these events and share really valuable information with our members. I would also like to welcome a few guests that are with us this afternoon. The Honorable Vaughan Solomon Schofield, members of Parliament Michael Cram, Warren Steinley, and Corey Tucker, members of the Legislative Assembly, Alina Young, Gary Gruel, and Laura Ross, Regina City Councillor, Tarina Shaw, and members of our Regina Chamber Board, Colin Poular, Board Chair, Laurie Ireland, Vice Chair, Sarah Tkachuk, Carrie Bodie, and Jason Dittman. And thank you to everyone else who has taken the time to join us this afternoon. I would now like to introduce Colin Poular, Chair of the Regina District Chamber of Commerce, to bring some additional introductions. Colin, over to you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this particular casting. Mr. O'Toole, thank you for joining us today. It's a great opportunity for me to introduce Mr. Warren Steinley, who will officially introduce you. And for those who do not know Mr. Steinley, Warren was first elected in 2019 and serves as a member of Parliament for Regina Louvain. Is also the Shadow Minister for Economic Development and International Trade. Warren, welcome, and I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you very much, Colin, and it's my pleasure to be here, and it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Erin O'Toole. Erin grew up in a GM family in Bowmanville, Ontario. At the age of 18, Erin joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and completed his studies at the Royal Military College. He continued his officer training in Chilliwack, British Columbia, then Winnipeg, Manitoba, and settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. As a tactical helicopter navigator, he participated in search and rescue missions off Canada's coast, rising to the rank of captain. After 12 years of service, Erin retired from the military and returned to school to complete a law degree at Dalhousie University. Erin spent the next decade working as a lawyer in the private sector. Loyal to his brothers and sisters in arms, Erin became one of the co-founders of the True Patriot Love Foundation, a national charity serving veterans and their families. Elected 3 times in his riding of Durham, Erin recently served as Shadow Cabinet Minister responsible for Foreign Affairs and was instrumental in establishing the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. However, his proudest accomplishments remain marrying his wife, Rebecca, and being a dad to his 2 children, Molly and Jack. Everyone, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Erin O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Warren, and thank you, Colin and Nicole as well. It's a real honor to be with all of you today. I wish I could be with you in person, but in COVID, we're doing these meetings, and I'm proud to meet with you virtually to hear from you and to discuss the ways we can support small and medium-sized businesses in Regina, Saskatchewan, and across Canada as we recover together from the pandemic. First, I want to acknowledge the work that's being done by the Saskatchewan Party, the caucus, and it's great to see Laura and some of her colleagues on here, and by Premier Scott Moe. We appreciate his leadership, and I appreciate our friendship. Similar to the Conservative Party, the Saskatchewan Party is also dedicated to smart reopening of the economy and creating jobs and competitiveness to help us recover economically from the COVID-19 pandemic. As leader of the Federal Conservative Party, I want to offer thanks to my colleagues, Corey, Michael, and particularly Warren, for the great advice that you've been able to give me about what's going on the ground in Saskatchewan. And in this pandemic, where I can't even get out and do this and hear from people directly, I depend on my incredible caucus members and friends to be the voice for their communities and their province. As leader of the opposition, I have a job to do in this pandemic, and that's to hold the Liberal government to account, to push for better. With COVID cases rising every day and greater restrictions coming as a result of the third wave, we are all frustrated to see Canada fall behind many in the developed world on vaccine deployment. That is why we're in this third wave, because the federal government failed to secure vaccines earlier. Canada used to be a leader, but under Mr. Trudeau, increasingly, we have become a laggard. Canada deserves better. We need to see the return of Canadian leadership, of Canadian ingenuity, of Canadian optimism. But most of all, we need to see the return of that leadership that plans for the future and is ready, not one that is 2 and 3 steps behind at every stage of this crisis. And as we come through the tunnel of this third wave and we see vaccinations on the horizon and perhaps a turning point in this pandemic, we also have to realize that our country is at a crossroads. Canadians at some point will have a choice to make. Which path do we want to take? The path of Justin Trudeau's reimagined economy with mega spending as far as the eye can see, and an ideological approach that will leave millions of families behind, or a steady and certain path to secure a future and an economic recovery for all Canadian families, regardless of region of the country. That's our conservative approach. And that's why last month we launched Canada's Recovery Plan, a plan to secure our future. Canada's Conservatives will enact the most comprehensive jobs plan our country has seen to recover the 1 million jobs lost during the pandemic within 1 year. And we won't stop there. We will partner with communities and provinces like Regina. Regina has a goal of being Canada's most vibrant city by 2030. And of course, with that comes increased pressure on local infrastructure. There's a critical need for solutions and additional action plans to make that goal, including establishing event funds, specific infrastructure, a winter strategy, and increasing labor participation, education, and investment opportunities for Indigenous Canadians. These goals have serious long-term ramifications and opportunities for the community, and you deserve a federal partner who will work with you to meet those needs. But for Regina to reach its goal, we must be able to open up the economy, specifically oil, gas, mining, agriculture, and manufacturing sectors, many of which are suffering and are the backbone of your economy. Only the Conservative Party is proud of all these resources that we produce or grow in our great country. And we will be the voice for areas of the country like yours. We will take immediate action to help the hardest hit sectors and help those who've suffered the most during this pandemic, including women, young people, and Indigenous Canadians. Statistics Canada indicates that COVID-19 pandemic has led to a significant increase in business closures and less openings in all provinces. That's also reflected in Saskatchewan, as the number of closing businesses doubled over the last year. The Conservative Party will have your back as we plan to rebuild the main streets of Regina and the rest of the country by assisting small businesses and providing incentives to invest in, rebuild, or even start new businesses. We need to get back to hosting world-class events that you're very good at, such as the Agribition, the Farm Progress Show, Country Thunder, and even Rough Rider games at the Mosaic Stadium. Now, I have to admit, my wife worked for the Toronto Argonauts and has a Grey Cup ring, but I have a soft spot for the Riders as well. You need a government at the end of the day who will stand with you and partner with you, not lecture you from Ottawa. The second pillar of our recovery plan, we will enact the toughest accountability and transparency laws in Canadian history. We must restore the faith of Canadians in our national institutions and in the government itself. We can do better than having a prime minister who is the subject of his third personal ethics investigation. Canadians deserve accountability. Our third pillar is one I think we've all seen. This last year has deepened Canada's mental health crisis. Families and communities across the country are struggling. 20% of Saskatchewan residents have said in polling that they've experienced high level of anxiety and even depression and other mental health issues in the last year because of COVID-19, more than double the rate before COVID. Access to services in Saskatchewan from a mental health professional has been in decline by almost 18% as the need grows. We must do more for the people in Saskatchewan across this great country by partnering with the provinces and with nonprofit groups. We will introduce a Canada Mental Health Action Plan that will boost these funding partnerships and make sure that there's on-the-ground support for people to get help faster and for us to tackle the stigma associated with mental health and wellness. The fourth pillar of our recovery plan is to make sure that our country is never unprepared for a crisis again. Canada's Conservatives will make Canada more resilient, reduce our reliance on countries like Communist China, and take seriously our responsibility to protect the health of Canadians. And that includes domestic vaccine and critical medicine capacity. Finally, our final pillar, a Conservative government will secure Canada's economy by getting the budget back to balance over the next decade. Conservatives, we supported spending during the pandemic to protect Canadians and small businesses. But I think we all know that we cannot pass unsustainable debt to our children and to future generations. The Liberals recently released their election budget. And now we know the emergency spending in response to COVID-19 was just beginning for the Trudeau Liberals. They don't want it ever to end. The spending in their budget is so astronomical that it puts the future of our great country at risk. It puts jobs at risk. It puts growth at risk. And with spending being crowded out, if interest rates go up, it puts healthcare at risk. It is a risk that Canadians cannot afford. Mr. Trudeau already, pre-COVID and within COVID, has doubled our national debt. And he doesn't seem to even care. In fact, to use a baseball term, he's rounding second and headed for third. He's headed and on track to triple the national debt and says this is a good time to run deficits because of low interest rates. He is setting this country up for failure, and we won't let that happen. Canadians know that that's reckless. So the Conservatives, once the recovery starts in earnest and we get the economy reopened as quickly as possible, we will start to get spending under control in a way that's fair, while securing the revenue needed to pay for the services that Canadians depend on by getting people back to work in all parts of the country and in all sectors of our economy. Recently, I was also proud to release the Conservative plan for climate change. The Liberal approach to climate change means big government taxing consumers, small businesses, and farmers, while also phasing out jobs in sectors of the country at a time we need them the most. The Conservative approach will empower Canadians and reduce emissions while preserving jobs in all parts of our economy. In fact, the Conservatives, we secured climate experts to verify the modeling that shows that the Conservative climate plan will achieve our country's emission reductions, but will grow jobs and the economy when compared to Mr. Trudeau's original plan. All the emission reductions promised, but without the disruption. And now he's promising to increase targets and taxes. It's reckless. And as Saskatchewan and Alberta consider their options following the Supreme Court decision, our plan as a federal partner gives them an option to eliminate the Trudeau carbon tax and its runaway escalating price and take an approach that will price carbon in a fair way for families, small business, and farming operators. Either way, a conservative government will respect and partner with the provinces. We will not be the top-down, Ottawa knows best. We will seek partnerships. The decisions we take in the next few years will define Canada for this generation and for the next. And as the father of two, as was said at the outset, my proudest accomplishment, and I know that's the case for Warren and Corey as well, our greatest worry is failing to leave a better and prosperous Canada for our children. That's what drives me. That's what drives our caucus. And in recent years, the ideological approach from the Trudeau government in Ottawa has been leading to a growing sense of Western alienation. I want to be very clear. A conservative government will strive to heal that divide. And we will come together as a country from coast to coast as we respect one another, we recover the jobs lost, and we work together to make Canada the top destination in the world for investment and for talent. So as we recover from COVID-19, Canadians deserve certainty and competent leadership. It's time we had a prime minister who was an ethical leader in it for you, as opposed to himself, his family, and some connected insiders. Our recovery plan will get the economy back on track in Regina and across Canada to secure a future for our children. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Toole, for those remarks. If anyone that is watching has any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box and we will ask those throughout our discussion. So Mr. O'Toole, you commented in response to the federal budget that, it has no plan for small businesses, which you mentioned in your remarks. They truly are the backbone of our economy, and they very much are still struggling, and it's going to take them a long time to recover. So what do you see as the most important priorities in both the short term and the long term to support our small businesses?
Well, thanks, Nicole. The budget was a major letdown for Canadians. No plan for meaningful job creation, runaway debt, a sprinkling of billions in a pre-election spending mode, and no real plan to address what the provinces were asking for, which was a dedicated and consistent plan for health and long-term care, the areas impacted most by COVID. Where we want to go with respect to small business is a couple of things. We need small and medium-sized businesses to not just survive this acute crisis, but to thrive afterwards. 2/3 of Canadians, and I know you know this from your membership, 2/3 of Canadians work for or are part of the ownership structure of a small and medium-sized business. If we see a wave of insolvencies, bankruptcies, we will see high and chronic unemployment at a time we need to ramp down programs of assistance like CERB-like benefits and others. So we need to strive for full employment. And that means the SME space, small and medium-sized businesses, need to thrive. So we're going to have some targeted support for acutely impacted businesses. In fact, we've brought many debates to Parliament over the last few months, focusing on highly affected sectors, be it tourism, be it hospitality, being it travel. I've spoken to the airport authorities in Saskatchewan. I've spoken to the tourism sector. I've spoken to small businesses, Indigenous leaders. All of them want targeted programs for the specific needs of the economy. We also need a plan to reopen as quickly as possible in a safe and data-driven way. It's why for a year, we've been calling for a national system of rapid testing and screening. We're going to need that as we see more variants, as we see risks over the horizon. We can't just lock down all the time because Mr. Trudeau is late with the vaccines. We have to make sure we have the ability to reopen in a data-driven and safe way. And finally, there are some really anti-competitive measures that Mr. Trudeau's been brought in. Bill C-69, Bill C-48, the tanker ban, a very anti-development of any kind. We need to make sure that Canada is open for business, because that affects not just large employers, but smaller. The great news about the Cargill investment in your community, that will have a ripple effect in the entire Regina region in terms of that economic development from a major investment like that. So we have to show that projects can be built, get done in this country, that we're proud of our resources, from energy to potash. We are the best and most ethical producer in the world, and that's how a conservative government will view it as we open up new markets, leveraging that ESG leadership.
Great, thank you. I'm interested in your comments on the National Daycare Plan that was announced by the Liberals in the recent budget. Firstly, what are your thoughts on what has been put forward? And are there things that your Conservative Party would look at differently in regards to a National Daycare Plan?
Great question, Nicole. Thank you. First off, I'll say, what do I think about what the Liberals put forward? This is the 9th time the Liberals have promised this National Daycare Plan. I've said recently, even cats only have 9 lives. Do Canadians trust anything that comes out of Mr. Trudeau's mouth? He hasn't met his promises on the deficit. He said he'd never run a deficit more than $10 billion. He's never even been close to that. He failed on his boil water pledge on Indigenous reserve communities. He hasn't met any of the central promises, including on emission reduction and climate change. So what we're going to provide for Canadians is flexibility. That's what families want. They want support that allows their family to be in the driver's seat to make decisions. And with a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old in our household, even before I was in politics, my wife Rebecca and I made decisions about what was best for our family. And if you're in suburbs or rural Canada, what Mr. Trudeau promised for the 9th time will never help your family. Even their own admission, Minister Freeland is saying this might help some people 5 years or more from now. Let's help families with real supports, and let's let them be in the driver's seat about what works best. And if we've learned anything, Nicole, from this pandemic, some families are even adjusting their own work-life balance with respect to telework, with respect to a consultancy and working independently, contracting, making decisions. Can a family member help out? Can mom or dad make decisions? Can a friend on the street? Can a traditional daycare space? There are so many options. Why should we limit the ability for families to get some sort of support for their decisions? So we're going to be launching our own specific set of policies that I think Canadians will see are realistic and will provide families with the flexibility they need.
Thank you. Virtually every economy of consequence needs large economic anchors, whether it be the steel mill, refinery, mining, yet we continue to create an increased regulatory environment and higher cost structure for many of these companies. How do we ensure that we keep and support those companies that we have and grow larger businesses within Canada in that industry?
Great question. And I've talked to our caucus, including Warren, a number of times about our steel production, our aluminum production in parts of the country, our manufacturing base, rare earth minerals, energy, all of these sort of anchor job creators, anchor industries help everyone. And they are not going to expand if the goalposts keep getting pushed further and further out in terms of regulatory approval, about transparency on decisions from government. When Mr. Trudeau cancels a pipeline like the Northern Gateway pipeline, 1/3 owned by Indigenous communities along the route and didn't even consult the Indigenous communities before an Ottawa ideological decision. Mr. Trudeau and Ms. Freeland threw steelworkers under the bus with respect to negotiations on NAFTA, with respect to tariffs. We should be aligned with the Americans and with our allies in a unified way with respect to China on their transshipment of these commodities, because they've been hurting our workers and gaming the global trade system as China's own performance on human rights, on environmental standards is worse and worse and worse. We are letting them game the system. So Mr. Trudeau is out of step with the Americans on Huawei, for example, out of step on steel and aluminum. So we need less regulatory complexity at home, more certainty on getting projects approved with the highest standards of environmental mitigation, Indigenous consultation, but capital needs certainty, and it certainly needs a sense that it's welcome in our country. And then with our closest trading partners, the democratic world, like the United States, the UK, Australia, and others, we have to align with respect to China or bad actors like Venezuela, Russia, and others. So I think with a conservative government, I worked on trade in the private sector as parliamentary secretary in the Harper government. And it's time we had a prime minister that brings some real world experience and judgment to the job and doesn't view his job as ceremonial as Justin Trudeau does.
Thank you. So Western Canadian energy is vital to our economic future. However, the future of the oil and gas industry is arguably at risk, with President Biden being somewhat less than friendly to Canadian oil. How can we ensure competitiveness and access to markets for our oil and gas industry?
First, I'm incredibly proud of our energy sector and its innovation and its work reducing its carbon intensity, partnering more and more with Indigenous Canadians in partnerships and even resource revenue sharing. And the fact that in comparison with any country in the world, including our friends, the United States, we have the highest level of transparency and the highest level of ESG compliance, environmental social governance in the world. I worked in the sector briefly. I inspected pipelines before I joined the military and did some work on legal issues in oil and gas as a starting out lawyer. And we have to let more Canadians know that the success in Saskatchewan and Alberta is Canadian success. And if we're selling a domestic resource at a discount, a finite resource, that is a failure if we can't rectify that. When it comes to the Americans, if I'm happy to hold up our standards alongside any of the American conventional or non-conventional extraction of hydrocarbons, what we actually have to work with the Biden administration on is North American standards when it comes to emissions, when it comes to energy security, both pipelines and electricity grid. We have to have a mutual approach with respect to China that Mr. Trudeau, maybe it's because of the admiration he declared years ago for the basic dictatorship, we've been out of step now with 3 presidents when it comes to China. And here's why that's so important. Steel and aluminum manufactured in China, if it's transshipped into Mexico or other parts of the world and we miss out, their products are up to 7 times more carbon intense. So they're gaming international emissions, they're gaming international trade, and we've got to stop it. So in our climate change plan, we've recommended working with the Americans on carbon border adjustments so that we can stop the bad actors of the world gaming the system at the expense of our workers.
Thank you. So along those lines, we have a question here from the membership on how will you counter the anti-pipeline lobby and sentiment that exists in large parts of our country?
This is where I think we have to really take the lead on having a serious and responsible debate on how pipelines, rail lines, any of these critical transmission corridors for hydropower, anything, are all in the national interest. Everyone benefits in Canada if we get a better price for our, as I said, finite resource. I years ago said to folks in Toronto, in the area that I represent in the GTA suburbs, when Ontario's auto sector was on its knees years ago in the 2009 global recession, it was our resource strength in Saskatchewan and Alberta that helped Canada emerge from that global recession faster than any other G7 country. We had less economic damage, and by the time we lost power in 2015, we were the only G7 country with a balanced budget. Justin Trudeau quickly got rid of that, sadly, but why were we able to do that? It was relying on the strengths of our Western partners in terms of energy, in terms of potash. I remember when the largest market cap on the TSX was potash. So we have to have more Canadians realize that our confederation is a partnership. And that partnership means we need to get our products to market, whether it's manufacturing goods through the Port of Montreal, which may, we have to make sure goods are moving there again, the Port of Vancouver. Our agricultural commodities are critical to our success, just as energy is. And a pipeline is a lot safer and more effective of delivering that product than a rail line. So I think we have to make sure that Canadians, we have to really step up in our way of defining the national interests with these important commodities, and that's what we're committed to do.
So in that vein, a question around equalization. And, the primary premise behind equalization is that it's supposed to treat every province equally. However, we would argue that natural resource criteria, being one of the inputs, is not treated fairly. And the forced implementation of a national carbon tax further exacerbates this inequality. How would you propose mitigating this?
It's a great question, and I've had some discussions with a number of people on this, including some of the premiers. Equalization, as you said, is about fairness. It's about respect. It's about the partnership that is confederation. Now, equalization is in our Constitution, but not the way it's formulated. So these are decisions that are made politically. And what we have to do is to make sure that the partnership that is Canada, our confederation, where provinces are working together for mutual success, that has to be respected. So what I've said is the unfair Bill C-69, which Mr. Trudeau brought in, that has caused challenges from pipelines through to any large project in this country, that holds back the economic potential of partners in confederation. It's actually unconstitutional in my view. But more importantly, 9 out of 10 premiers asked Mr. Trudeau not to bring that bill in. So it's at the very least undemocratic. So let's eliminate those provisions. Let's work together to make sure each province can develop their resources in a way that's achieving employment and opportunity for its province, that's providing funds for healthcare and all the necessary services and benefits the whole country. And we can reduce emissions. We can hold high standards of transparency, engagement with Indigenous communities. We can do all those things because industry already is. We're world leaders. Then we have to have a discussion on, once we're not holding back provinces, as Mr. Trudeau has been doing in the last few years, how can we make sure that the Confederation, everyone has confidence in it, and to make sure that equalization is about helping achieve high standards for all of the country, and then it's not unfair and eroding people's confidence. So it's time for us to build confidence back into equalization, first by removing those barriers like Bill C-69 and others, and to make sure it treats revenue sources fairly. And it's not just Alberta and Saskatchewan, Nicole, that have raised this. Newfoundland and Labrador and some other provinces have raised. We have to have a fair approach when it comes to respecting resource revenue generation and recognition of that at the provincial level.
Thank you. Another question from our membership here, that, illnesses such as cancer and other types of illnesses will be increasing due to the redeployment of healthcare providers to the COVID front lines and dealing with the pandemic. How do you propose to deal with these concerns and issues that we may have going forward as a result?
Well, certainly we've already seen the strain on our healthcare system as a result of COVID throughout the crisis, and cancer treatments, surgeries canceled. The risks to Canadians, the decline in quality of life is real. And I've talked about the mental health crisis, including rising addiction rates. We've seen terrible rises in domestic violence and other things. So we're going to try and partner with a national mental health strategy to address part of that. The other issue is partnering with the provinces to address some of the gaps and some of the backlog that will be created as of COVID. The backlog's twice as bad because Mr. Trudeau has been so slow in getting us sufficient vaccines. But that's what was missing in this budget. The premiers have all said through their Council of the Confederation that the strain on the healthcare systems and long-term care was what needed to be addressed with long-term, stable, and increasing funding to address those gaps. What did Mr. Trudeau really say about that in the budget? Nothing. So he promised something for the 9th time, thinking it might help him with his re-election, and he ignored the provinces who are dealing with these backlogs and these families who are at wit's end with delays in cancer treatments, delays in diagnosis, which can sometimes mean delayed treatment option. So we have to address that. The federal government, we don't run the provincial systems. We have to respect them, but dedicating a predictable and increasing amount of funding is step number one.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, we have another question from the membership. What is your position on capital gains taxation on principal residences?
Thank you, Nicole. This is an important question because Canadians have to become aware of what Mr. Trudeau has on his radar. They have a study underway through a Crown agency. They've made changes to tax forms in terms of tracking home values. Some of his MPs have talked about a home equity tax. Mr. Trudeau has his eyes on taxing people's home equity, so eliminating the capital gains exemption for primary residents. Conservatives will fight tooth and nail against that. It's part of the reason we need a responsible budget, not something that is spending hundreds of billions and doubling and tripling our debt, because Mr. Trudeau will be raising taxes across the board, and it should scare people out of their complacency. So there's been a lot of writing and indications on what Trudeau's been building towards. That would be profoundly unfair for Canadians who, in the vast majority of cases, save for their retirement through the equity in their home. So we will never let that happen under our watch. And it's one of the big reasons people should wake up to this spending crisis that Mr. Trudeau is causing.
Thank you. Though Premier Scott Moe has said he prefers your climate plan to Mr. Trudeau's, he's still opposed to broad-based carbon pricing. If after discussion, Saskatchewan continued to oppose carbon pricing on fuel, would a Conservative government allow this, or would you insist on your plan as a backstop?
That's a great question. I'm glad people ask the important questions here. I know Premier Moe would have preferred a different decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, right? There were 3 provinces that brought a challenge, including my own in Ontario. And what we have to do is have an approach of fairness that respects provincial plans. So I know Premier Moe, I've had the good fortune to get to know him quite well. He's a great leader, and he's working with his team, trying to have a made in Saskatchewan approach that I will respect, and we will respect equivalencies if provinces can meet reduction targets that we all want to get to. And I often remind even my own team, because we've got so many great new MPs like Corey, Michael, and Warren on our call here. I was in cabinet with Stephen Harper when we set these targets. These targets, let's not kid ourselves, are going to be a challenge for Canada to achieve, but I know we can do it, the 30% targets. In 1 week, Mr. Trudeau has increased the targets by 15%. Why? Because I put out a better, smarter plan that I will propose to the provinces. Mr. Trudeau's plan is just tax, 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 tax. What we have offered is an option for the provinces. Now that Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario are going to be looking at their own plan, they're going to be looking at maybe joint regional plans. Do they want to consider, what other provinces are doing? Quebec has a cap and trade. New Brunswick has their own plan. I will not be in Ottawa knows best dictating what the provinces do. We are the party of partnering. And I've told that to Premier Moe. We were all watching that Supreme Court decision, and it was unsuccessful. So we have a modeled plan that can make our emission reduction, increase jobs and investment dramatically compared to Mr. Trudeau. And our plan is not a tax. Now, I know people give me a lot of guff on that, but a basic part of a definition of a tax is sending the revenue for Ottawa to make spending decisions on or to redistribute. That's really what their tax is. They take from farmers, they take from rural Canadians, they redistribute it around. And we all know we can't trust Mr. Trudeau with a cent, let alone billions. So our plan puts people in the driver's seat, lets them see their own carbon footprint in terms of purchase of hydrocarbons. And instead of just having a savings, a checking, you'll have a third account. You'll have your low carbon savings account, and then you will drive decisions from it. It's innovative, and it's one more option for the provinces to look at as we work together to make those targets.
Thank you. There was a few questions around that, which I think you answered within that question very well. How will you attempt to appeal to the average Canadian in the days to come that shows a really optimistic way forward without getting caught up in partisanship and attack ads, those kinds of things?
It's a great question. I am an average Canadian, and I'm in it because I want to fight for average Canadians. I'm a kid from the suburbs of Toronto who grew up in a middle-class home. We had our own little struggles with adversity and other things, but I was always taught to work hard, strive to be my best, help my neighbor, and help my community. That led me to join the military. When I left and got into the business world, I always made sure I gave back, whether it was to veterans and military families, whether as a Rotarian, a member of the Legion, raise funds for conservation projects, for shelters for people fleeing violence. I was taught to whom much is given, much is expected. And I'm in this privileged position to stand and ask for people's trust to become Prime Minister, not because of where I was born or what I was entitled to, but because I've worked hard to earn the trust of Canadians. And I think what can Canadians who are worried about our future coming out of the pandemic, who are frustrated with the slow vaccine deployment, we deserve better. We deserve a transparent and ethical government. We deserve one that has a plan to be ready for a crisis in the future, one that will try and heal some of the rifts we've seen. The Western alienation was the first thing I brought up in my first call with Mr. Trudeau. Because I remember back when I was a cabinet minister in the Conservative government, we had a balanced budget, we had investment flowing into Canada, and we didn't have a ripple of national unity crisis. The Bloc Québécois was not an official party. They're now back to third place in the House of Commons, more seats than the NDP. And the alienation in Saskatchewan and Alberta is real. And that's all come as a result of 5.5 years of ideological, often incompetent and divisive government. It can also be healed by ethical government that will look to make sure every province can fulfill its potential. And that will be my goal. I've had the good fortune in my military time to live and serve in all regions of the country. And I will never lose sight of the fact that I'm the kid from Bowmanville that has a unique privilege to make my country a better place for my kids. And I think the more people get to see that, I'm not entitled to this job. I'm working hard to earn it.
Thank you. Maybe just building on that last question a little bit, you've spoken recently about the Conservatives Party's need to change and grow. So who is the Conservative of today in terms of the average person that you're trying to attract?
Well, I think what I think people often forget is we won the popular vote in the last election. I tell some people in my province that, and they're surprised. You know, in Saskatchewan, because every seat is blue, and I love that. And I wish we had a few more in my province. We won the popular vote, but we need to win more votes in parts of the country where we won maybe in 2011, but it's been a decade, and we've got to work on building trust with some of those voters. More young voters. I want them to see that Mr. Trudeau's putting literally $1 trillion worth of debt on their shoulders, and he's giving them less employment opportunities, less chance to ever own a home, and more national debt. How is that fair? So maybe they haven't voted Conservative in the past, but hey, we've got a smart climate change plan. We're going to get people back to work, and we're going to bring the country together. I think that's attractive to young people. We need more women, particularly women entrepreneurs and small business owners, have been adversely affected by this pandemic. The She Session, Mr. Trudeau has no plan to address it. He talks about it all the time. We actually do. And I think new Canadians, many of them small business owners, entrepreneurs, come here for great opportunity, and then within a few years they're employing other Canadians. It's an amazing story. A few years ago, Mr. Trudeau called small business owners tax cheats. So we're going to try and reach out using our ideas, our policies, our fresh approach in some areas, and some conservative principles on business, on the economy, on job creation, to try and say, hey, take a look at the Conservative Party. Canadians deserve better. And coming out of COVID-19, we have to be ready for a crisis in the future, and we have to start addressing the risks of the debt. We can't leave these problems for our children. We have to tackle them today. And so I'm optimistic that we will build on that largest percentage of the vote. We need 1 million more votes in the next election.
Thank you. Another question from our membership. Canada is facing a growth in racial discrimination, especially among Asian Canadians. How would you plan to fight that?
I have been trying to fight it already. We've seen an alarming increase, in hate crimes towards Asian Canadians, Chinese Canadians, and a growing level of intolerance. In fact, I've talked about how many Chinese Canadians in particular have a double threat of rising intolerance and also rising influence operations in Canada by the Communist Party of China, which tries to track who is commenting on Hong Kong or the Uyghurs. So we have to deal with that foreign direct operations in our country. And we have to send the signal that there is zero tolerance for intolerance. In fact, we are a great country, but we have a lot of work to do to make sure that everyone has the same opportunity to reach their potential. And I think we've been trying to be part of the conversation about highlighting this alarming rise in anti-Asian Canadian and hate crimes. We'll continue to do that. And I think the Conservative Party is uniquely positioned because our core beliefs in the individual reaching their potential so that they can build a strong community, a strong country, that means no one should have barriers in their reaching potential. Indigenous Canadians, new Canadians, racialized Canadians, I think that motivates me. And I've seen how through my time in the Canadian Armed Forces, doesn't matter your background, if you're willing to put your country first, if you're willing to do these things, it's empowering how groups that have been struggling under these circumstances strive and are still making our country great. And so we deserve to fight for them and to end discrimination.
Thank you. So you touched on it a little bit in your last response, but you've spoken a lot about the importance of Indigenous relationships and reconciliation. Indigenous people are vital to Saskatchewan's future. What steps do you believe are necessary in relation to reconciliation and building relationships with Indigenous peoples?
Great question. And you talked about Treaty 4 at the beginning, and our commitment both legally through treaties, constitutionally, and our commitment, our shared commitment to reconciliation. My first question in the House of Commons was on reconciliation. And this is something I've worked on in the private sector, did some work with Aboriginal-based business startups and economic reconciliation. I've talked about issues related to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's situation, child welfare, the terrible case of Tina Fontaine in Manitoba. We have to do better. And let me be clear, Nicole, I truly believe Mr. Trudeau is sincere on everything he says and does with respect to reconciliation. But reconciliation is also at its core about restoring trust between the government of Canada and First Nations and Indigenous Canadians across the country. And building trust means you don't make promises that you have no plan or really no objective to actually meet. Boil water advisories on reserve is an example. To restore that trust, you not only have to make your promises, you have to engage Indigenous leadership in it. So we're going to be actually having some very innovative policies. I've talked to so many members of Indigenous leadership councils. Gary Vidal, our MP in Saskatchewan, is also doing great work, reaching out and getting perspectives. I would love to see a level of governance and a level of participation in all aspects of reconciliation being driven by First Nations. If we haven't been able to solve some of these challenges in the last 50 years in Ottawa, why do we think doing things the same way is going to lead to a better result? I'm a firm believer in partnerships, whether with Indigenous enterprise groups, whether it's with the private sector. We all have to play a role, but I will be demanding better results.
Thank you. What do you see under a Conservative government for Canada's military?
Okay, maybe one of my friends planted this question. I'm obviously very proud of my time in the Canadian Armed Forces. I got my wings as a navigator at Winnipeg when all my friends were in Moose Jaw getting their pilot training, and got to see the base, and very proud of our home base of the Snowbirds. And I would be the first veteran to become Prime Minister since Lester B. Pearson. And I think what the military needs is two things. Right now, there's a crisis of leadership because of sexual misconduct allegations. And it's been painful to watch the cover-up by Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Sajan over the last 3 years. Just on Friday, the cover-up was confirmed when everyone around the Prime Minister were aware of allegations and did nothing for 3 years. In fact, extended the contract of the Chief of Defense Staff and gave him a bonus while there was an unresolved sexual misconduct allegation. Our women in uniform deserve better. And I'll tell you, I've served with some incredible women in our forces, and they deserve better, including Julianne McKenzie, a friend of mine from Saskatchewan, who gave her life in serving the country as a pilot. I talked about her this last Remembrance Day because I have this privileged position to make sure people like Julianne are remembered. And we owe it to them to have leadership cleaned up in the military, and I will make sure that happens. The second thing is procurement. We need to make sure we get our men and women the equipment they need, and they not become these political games that we've seen with my old helicopter, the Sea King. We've seen now with the fighter jet replacement, where we buy the used secondhand goods of our allies. It's embarrassing, and it actually puts lives at risk. So we'll fix military procurement to make sure we get our men and women what they need to do the job for us.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one last question from our membership here. How will you manage your party so that they don't hijack your economic recovery ideas with ideological stances on social issues that maybe aren't popular with the majority of Canadians? Canadians want change and what you're talking about, but maybe not some of the really extreme conservative ideologies.
Well, look, you know, our party is a big blue tent. And in fact, in this time where people are becoming so cynical about politics, you know, Mr. Trudeau calls himself the first feminist prime minister we've had. How did the Jody Wilson-Raybould case go? How did the Jane Philpott case go? Mr. Trudeau, he lost 4 MPs, all women. So we have to show that we're a big tent party that respects everyone, that respects free speech, that respects fundamental liberties. And I think that makes us a cross-section of Canada. In an age where, you see on social media, people can't even disagree without being disagreeable anymore, I'm proud that our party tries to respect all viewpoints and to do it in a way that's also making sure we focus on the core priorities for Canadians. I've been very clear as leader that I will be focused on getting our country back on track economically, dealing with our national unity challenges as a result of Mr. Trudeau, and providing ethical, serious government for a change. Mr. Trudeau, with his countless ethical scandals, the We charity where his family was paid, and then he's giving untendered contract in the middle of a pandemic when he suppressed Parliament, that is atrocious. Canadians will know I'm in it for them. And I've also said, I'm in it to stand up for the rights of Canadians, and that's been my personal track record. And that also includes rights like free speech and other things. So we have to learn to be respectful, that there'll be a different point of view on some things. But as leader, I've been crystal clear what my priorities are. And I think after COVID, after seeing Canada behind other G7 countries, after seeing, us past the $1 trillion debt level and Trudeau shooting for 2 trillion, people want certainty, competence, and ethics, and that's what they'll get with me.
Thank you. One last comment from our members. Mr. O'Toole, next year's Grey Cup is scheduled to play in Regina. Can we count on you to attend as our Prime Minister?
What an absolute privilege that would be. And I can tell you, the riders are well represented in our caucus. I think the team is mentioned almost on a weekly basis. What an honor it would be. And if you'd permit, my wife would come with her Argos Grey Cup ring, just as a sign of bringing together Canadians from east and west under a great game with in a great stadium in a great province.
Absolutely. I look forward to that. Well, thank you very much, Mr. O'Toole. That's all the time that we have this afternoon. On behalf of the Regina Chamber, thank you so much for joining us today. Our business community really appreciates hearing more about your plan and priorities for Canada's future. Also, thank you again to our sponsors and to everyone for attending. That concludes our event. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Colin.